with our group of speakers. We have two more presentations before noon, so if folks could come in and gather around. We're going to hear next from Lew Ziska. He's with the USDA-ARS in Beltsville, Maryland, and he's probably going to talk a little bit about weeds and maybe some other things. So, Lew, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. Let me preface the talk that I'm about to give with the idea that I can't possibly in the next 30 minutes provide you with all of the information regarding weed biology, climate change, and CO2. I'm going to give you sort of a slice of the pie. So if there are questions or areas of research that you didn't see addressed during the presentation, please come see me afterwards, and I'd be happy to share my ignorance with you as best I can. When we look at weeds, let me sort of start from a historical perspective. Globally, weeds represent the greatest biotic constraint to crop yield relative to disease and insects. In the United States, the best estimates are that with herbicide application, we still lose about 10% of production as a function of weed competition. If you look at this as a best management practices or BMP relative globally to what's happening, that loss is about 25%, and of course if no effort is made to control weeds, the loss is 100%. So overall, weeds are the greatest biotic constraint to crop production, particularly in developing countries. We spend more money on controlling weeds. We apply more pesticides in controlling weeds than we do for any other pest threat. When we look at climate change and look at crop weed responses, we have sort of two major categories. We would call that the abiotic or physical constraints, particularly changes in temperature, but also increasing variation in temperature and precipitation with more frequent extremes. Here's just a quick map from Climate Central showing records, temperature records that were broken, I think, in 2012. But since that time, I'm sure there have been other records that have also been shattered. But there's also another issue, and that's the biotic issue, and that is that the increase in carbon dioxide represents an increase in a basic resource needed for plant growth. Now we know that about roughly 94% of all plant species lack the optimal amount of carbon dioxide, and so giving them more CO2, plants are going to respond to that in the same way they would respond if you gave them more light, or if you gave them more water, or if you gave them more soil nutrients. So what are the end results of that going to be? Well, the initial paradigm of all of this in terms of looking at this biotic response of weeds and crops was that CO2 is plant food, and therefore that will mean fewer weeds. Now that seems kind of weird, but it's really based on a seminal work that, if you're a weed scientist, was on your nightstand in grad school, and that was a work by Holm et al. Called The World's Worst Weeds, and it's often referred to in discussions about which weed is causing the greatest impact. And it's a really seminal work. It's the first systematic attempt to evaluate globally different weed problems in agriculture. It really represents the work of dozens of different weed scientists from different countries from around the world. And the focus is on global agriculture and what the worst weeds are associated with different crops globally. And one of the observations from this work was that many of the crops had what's referred to as a C3 photosynthetic pathway. That is a photosynthetic pathway that is lacking optimal amounts of CO2 and therefore will respond to increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, while many of the weeds had a C4 photosynthetic pathway, a different pathway that ostensibly is saturated at current levels of CO2, and we can argue about that another time. Just to sort of give you Plant Phys 101 here, the rice being a C3 crop, you can see as CO2 goes up, it's responding. The Soteria, this is Soteria verdis, green foxtail, is C4, responds and then sort of doesn't respond anymore. Now, Soteria doesn't actually grow in competition with rice, but we'll ignore that for the moment. So that was sort of the paradigm. You looked at it and said, well, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe weeds will respond less and be less of a potential pest threat as CO2 increases. And so many of the initial studies that were done with C3 crops and C4 weeds, so soybean and sorghum halepense, rice and echinocloa. And when you look at the results from these studies, what you find is that invariably, yes, the crop did do better. Well, there's a slight, so that's the paradigm, that CO2 crops, weed competition will decline as crop losses as CO2 increases. The problem with paradigms, they change. If I go back now and look at the homework from 1977, and I look at for North America, for corn, soybean, and wheat, these are the major troublesome weeds that are listed. And corn is a C4, and you can see many of them are C4. Soybean C3, many of them are C4. And wheat, many of them are C3. So just the basic understanding of, well, yeah, C3 crops always compete with C4 weeds. Well, no, they never really did. And if you go forward in looking at the Weed Science Society estimates for North America now, what are the most troublesome weeds? And the new weeds are in yellow, the old weeds where they overlap from the previous list are in white. They don't match up anymore. Things change, crops change, management changes. Lots of things change. This idea that, oh, crops are C3 and weeds are C4, and therefore as CO2 goes up, they're going to have a better chance of getting fewer reductions due to crop competition. No, that's no longer the case, is it? Worst changes with time. And the reality is that C3 and C4 crops compete with C3 and C4 weeds. On average, any crop in the field competes with 8 to 10 different weed species. So if you do a more, let us say, more robust examination of what's going on, where the wheat is a C4, the soybean is C3, hey, that happens. The crop does occur, it is favored. But for everything else, it is a C4 weed growing with a C4 crop, or a C3 weed growing with a C3 crop. In fact, it's the weed that is in fact favored as CO2 increases. Now let's look at it from a different, what I call the CO2 plus experiment. So there's only been a handful of these. That is where you take the old paradigm of C3 crops and C4 weeds, but then you do a plus. You add CO2 plus temperature, CO2 plus drought, CO2 plus nitrogen deficit. And in all of these instances, it turns out that even though the wheat is C4, it does not, in fact, respond in the same way that you would with just CO2 alone. In fact, it's the weed that's consistently favored if you add more than just the CO2 aspect of climate change. I'm going to offer you a different definition of worst. Often the worst weed can be a wild or weedy relative of the crop. So in the case of oat and wild oat, sorghum and shattercane, rice and red rice, okay? And just to give you some sense of why is that? Well, first of all, if you're choosing a set of environmental conditions to grow a crop, you are in effect choosing the same environmental conditions for the weedy relative of that crop. And it's also difficult to identify. A lot of weed science is based on weed identification. And if the weed and the crop are the same genus or the same genus and species, it's very difficult to distinguish them. So they may not be recognized as a weed and removed until the damage has been done. So in fact, if you look at rice yield loss from heavy season-long weed interference, and red rice, or weedy rice, is in fact the #1 weed. So what happens when you take a weedy rice and a cultivated rice and you grow them together? Well, if you look at the seed yield for Clearfield, which is a chemical mutant cultivated line, at 3, 4, and 500 parts per million CO2, you see these numbers. It's increasing, yes, CO2 is in fact a resource, but it's not nearly as increasing as much as the red or wild weedy rice line. So what happens when I put these together? Here's 8 plants of the weed per, 8 weedy plants per square meter. Here's 16 weedy plants per square meter. Again, 300, 400, and 500. We wanted to include 300 because that's sort of the change that's already occurred from 3 to 400. And then, of course, looking at near-term CO2 projections. So if we do this, the relative yield of seed, Stuttgart to Clearfield, that is the weedy rice to the cultivated rice, goes way up. Weeds do better. And they do better in the sense of causing greater amounts of damage, in this instance for rice. So worst weeds respond more to a resource change than the crop. As such, crop losses are likely to increase, not decrease, with higher CO2 concentrations. A little bit about Clearfield rice. Clearfield rice is a chemical mutant, and there is a distinction with a difference there, and that is not a GMO. It's a chemical mutant, so it's easy to sell as around the world as weedy rice becomes more of an issue. Clearfield rice is usually planted. It has a mutant line that confers tolerance to mazapur herbicides, but there is a small amount of outcrossing, about 0.3%, between red rice and cultivated rice. Outcrossing is based largely on floral synchronicity, spatial proximity, and genetic compatibility. Again, you're dealing with the same genus and species, one wild, one cultivated. So one of the things that we looked at was, can the CO2 effect by itself influence outcrossing rates and the transfer of herbicide resistance? So we looked at Clearfield 161, again, that's the cultivated line that's resistant to the herbicide. We planted it with a red rice line at a ratio of 7:1 for 3 CO2 concentrations, 300, 400, and 600 parts per million. And then we did it in growth chambers, because you can't get pre-CO2 concentrations in field levels. It's just not possible. So we did that, and then we took the seed and we grew it out in Arkansas at the USDA rice lab. We planted it there, and as Clearfield rice crosses at low rates with red rice, any herbicide-resistant hybrid could be confirmed using DNA fingerprinting. So here we have the 300 part per million experiment, Clearfield 161 female, but here at 600 parts per million, the light green are the red rice plants within the field. And what we found was that the percent outcrossing and outcrosses per plot for the pollen donor as detected by the cultivated and wild rice populations in the field plots. This is the number of outcrosses, and this is the percent outcrossing at the different CO2 concentrations, again from Clearfield and the wild or weedy rice line. We were basically getting a lot of outcrossing coming from the weedy rice to the cultivated rice. Now when that happens, the cultivated rice does not become a super cultivated rice. In fact, it de-domesticates. It becomes a weedy rice again. And as a result of that, the number of weedy rice plants within the field actually went up as a result of increasing CO2. And this was due in part to differences in synchronicity. That is the lag time in flowering between when the wild rice flowers and when the cultivated rice flowers. At 300 parts per million is about 10 days, drops to about 8 days, and then at 600 it drops to about 2 days. So in times in which they overlap, in which that gene transfer can occur, are affected by the change in CO2. The weedy rice grows quickly early on, it flowers earlier relative to the cultivated rice, and as a result of that, you get a lot of pollen transfer occurring and a lot more weedy rice. So it's from the wild to the cultivated population, subsequent increase in rice de-domestication, and a greater number of weedy herbicide-resistant hybrid progeny as a function of the change in CO2 by itself. What's the difference in biotic response between wild and cultivated? Why do we see that difference? Well, let's look at wild and cultivated rice lines. These are 8 cultivated rice lines and 8 wild red rice lines. Now, we can use different parameters. In this instance, I've used leaf area as a function of total biomass at 55 days after sowing. If you look at the 300 parts per million line, again, this is a reminder, this is early 20th century. We see pretty much the open circles of the cultivated, the closed circles of the weedy rice, they're pretty much responding the same. But at 400 parts per million, what we're seeing is this segregation. We're seeing it's the weedy rice that's responding, not the cultivated rice. In fact, if you look at the seed yield, again, it's Clearfield versus Stuttgart, it's the Stuttgart line at the change in CO2 that has already occurred that's showing the greater response. So there is a suggestion that there's been selection by nature for increased sensitivity to recent changes in atmospheric CO2 in contrast to artificial selection. So can these recent increases in CO2 be a selection factor in weed biology and competitive performance? Is in fact CO2 a means by which weedy rice is becoming more adapted to the current environment? In this case, we're looking at a different cereal. We have wild oat and cultivated oat. And of course, in the US and a number of states, these occur together. But one of the problems we face is that all of the experiments that we do with 300 parts per million, of course, are with seed that we currently collect. That's kind of an issue. So here's a little serendipity for you. One day I get a call. Dr. Ziska, we found a room that has a lot of old weed seeds that were collected in it from the 1960s. Should we throw them away? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, hell no. Keep those things. Because it's a snapshot in time. That wild oat that was collected back in the 1960s, well, that was collected at a time when phones were different. And the overall CO2 concentration was about 319 parts per million, right? So we'll call that wild oat old. And we'll compare that to, fortunately when it was collected, they noted where it was collected. So we could go back to the same site and collect wild oat from 2013 from that location at 395 parts per million CO2. We'll call that wild oat new, okay? Now, we're going to check and see how it's going to do against Clinton 64, which is a cultivated oat line. And let me give you sort of, for some of you may already know this, but let me give you sort of some context for this. If you're a breeder, you want uniformity. You don't want the genes to change at all. For Clinton 64, it has rust resistance. So if I'm doing any breeding in the future, I want to make damn sure that Clinton 64 always has that rust resistance that I can include in whatever breeding program I have going forward. Clinton was released or registered officially in 1978. It has been grown twice since that time under very controlled conditions to make sure that outcrossing was zero, that its genome stayed exactly the same. Okay, I want to give you that caveat. So when we look at the monocultures of the two different weed populations, one collected in the 1960s, one collected in 2013, we looked at the two different populations. The red is the new, leaf area, stem weight, total weight, and leaf weight. This is after the first 30 days. And I should explain that early response to CO2 is important. And then when you look at crop weed competition, usually a lot of that competition becomes evident in the first 30 days following emergence. So this is what we saw. And it was clear that there was very little change in the wild oat going from old to current CO2 conditions, but there was a significant change, well, 0.06, I'm going to fudge a bit on that, for all of these different parameters with respect to the new wild oat population. And if I grow this with the cultivated oat, and I look at the PRY, and I explain PRY as the plant relative yield, that is, it's pretty simple. You grow the weed and the crop under various ratios, and you look at the PRY, and what you're looking at is species A growing in competition with species B divided by species A growing in competition with species A, or species B growing in competition with species B. If the value of one, if the value goes up, then it means it's doing better and it gives you some sense of its competitive ability. So in this instance, if you look at the CO2 back in the 1960s, the cultivated oat, the CO values were consistently higher. In this case, we're looking just at leaf area and above ground biomass 30 days after sowing. So in fact, cultivated oat was a better competitor back in the 1960s, but if we compare it to the wild oat collected today, in fact, it's the wild oat that is the superior competitor. Now, does this mean that uniformly, globally, You're seeing a change with respect to wild oat adapting faster to cultivated oat? No. This is a single population. I'm not going to make that kind of broad leap. But I would point out that there are temporally very different means by which breeding occurs. Breeding is a very conservative, very slow process. It takes decades to get a new line, cultivated line, on the market. Weeds can adapt very quickly, and there is plenty of evidence in the literature showing that, in fact, they can evolutionarily adapt to very quick changes in the environment. So why are weeds adapting to CO2 and not crops? Well, part of the answer, of course, is McDonald's. Or, well, it's not just McDonald's. It's Anheuser-Busch, it's Nestle, any food company. How many of you have actually eaten at McDonald's? You're among friends. It's okay. Raise your hand. Yeah, right. Okay. Just 3 of you have ever eaten at McDonald's. That's really interesting. I like their fries. Okay. I really like their fries. They're great, right? Crunchy on the outside, soft in the middle. Why is that? Why do you suppose that is? Well, it could be because McDonald's has been using one variety of potato, Russet Burbank, for the last 50, 60 years. They've tried to improve it, but they can't. Anheuser-Busch uses a handful of genome, or a handful of barley varieties to grow their beer. So when you have that kind of economic success, you don't want to mess with it. So when you look at breeding, and this is really not doing it justice, I only put in the red and the blue balls there. Think of it as a giant jar of M&Ms with 1,000 different colors. And breeders are only looking for the pale ecru genes, okay? Because that's their economic model requires that they only get the pale ecru genes. So as Jim brought up earlier, we're not just choosing a very small number of plants to grow. Within those plants, we're only choosing a very small percentage of the actual overall genome. Even though the weedy rice or the weedy oat or the weedy sorghum, in fact, represents a much larger genome from which to choose from. We're not doing it. So what happens if we do? What happens if we begin to select for CO2 and temperature responses, not just for the cultivated lines, but in fact for the wild or weedy lines? Well, this is weedy rice, Stuttgart here again. These are 3 cultivated rice lines. Here are the day-night temperatures, 29-21, 31-23, 33-25. This is seed yield, gram per plant. And what we see is that, yes, at optimal temperatures, we can get increasing seed yield, but temperature, it goes away. Here's the Stuttgart line. Blows them out of the water in terms of seed yield. Why are weeds adapting? What characteristics are associated with a greater increase in seed yield as CO2 increases? Well, sorry, I know this is complicated, but as an academic, I got to show you at least one slide that has so much information on it that nobody could possibly understand it. So this is my contribution to my academic roots. Anyway, what this shows are the different cultivars. So this, again, the weedy cultivar, looking at days after sowing, and we're looking here at tiller production. Why tiller production? It seems kind of weird. Well, it turns out that back in the Green Revolution days, it was seen that many of the varieties would produce extra tillers that didn't produce any panicles. Well, that's not good. We don't like that. So we're going to just choose the rice and the wheat that has a few tillers but really productive panicles. The problem is that when I give that particular idiotype more CO2, seeds get a little bit bigger, but it doesn't do a lot. But if I give the weedy type, which has more tillers, more CO2, those tillers produce panicles because I have a sink for that additional carbon. Son of a gun. Let me sum up quickly because I'm running out of time. There's no basis for assuming that as CO2 increases or as the climate changes, that CO2 is going to be plant food and everything is going to be wonderful, and that weeds will do worse than the crops. In fact, if anything, we see time and time again the actual opposite effect. You cannot predict what will happen based solely on photosynthetic pathway. And the evidence that we have so far, in fact, suggests that weeds, as the CO2 increases, will impose a greater limitation on crop production. The worst weeds, often wild relatives of the crop, are better able to adapt to the increase in CO2 and/or temperature associated with future conditions. The adaptation may include, but is not limited to, gene transfer to wild to cultivated lines, increased herbicide resistance, and enhanced adaptation to CO2. Can we learn from these weedy, uncultivated lines that are genetically related to the major crops in the world? And I think we can. They basically can serve as a means to help us adapt to a climate that's changing very quickly. This is not to take anything away from McDonald's fries. If the climate is not changing, having a russet Burbank potato is great. But if the climate is changing and you only have one genome that you're going to use to try and adapt to that change, you're in a world of hurt. Having these available genomes in terms of what's there in nature represents, I think, an untapped opportunity for us to begin to select among that as a means to maintain food security. So maybe weeds in this case also represent an opportunity. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Lew. Are there any questions right off the top here? Any online questions? So your last point was interesting because you know, there's related McDonald's, Walmart, these companies that are food suppliers, and there's a lot of initiative to, you know, encourage sustainable practices, whether it's managing pests, whether it's, you know, fertility, that kinds of thing. And so I guess I'm wondering, and I don't know if you've seen it or experienced, but is the same kind of emphasis placed on diversifying the genome of the crop that they're producing to maintain that?
The overall economic model for food production is better, faster, cheaper, uniformity. The problem is that is not the best strategy, and Jim kind of alluded to this in terms of looking at long-term ecological sustainability. In fact, it's the opposite. You cannot manufacture food in the same way that you manufacture a CD. That economic model, while it's good in the short term, may not be good as a means to adapt to an uncertain climate.
So adding in the environmental fact, I mean, so the sustainability is, you know, economics, social and environment, and the environment a lot of times that's brought up last because the economics drive a lot of things.
Right,
and
right.
So, but with climate change, it's increasing the importance of the environment to levels that we haven't seen before.
Right, but that hasn't, you're absolutely right. The issue, though, is in terms of traditional breeding or even you know, genetic breeding, GMO breeding, that's not there. What is being bred for now are things like taste, insect and pest resistance, traditionally, that have been done. There are no, to my knowledge, no breeding programs at the government, university, or private level that are in fact doing this kind of selection for means to adapt any major cereals to rising CO2 and/or climate change. The exception has been in the last probably 5-6 years or so, where we've started doing this mostly for rice, and we've also gotten some Japanese and Chinese colleagues that are also doing it for rice, looking at how CO2 and/or wild genomes might be suitable for adaptation to climate change. But again, that's a very slow process. And often what we find is that the climate is changing faster than our ability to breed for it. There's an excellent paper, I think it's Nature Climate Change, Andy Challenor just came out looking at corn breeding for temperature. And basically it takes about 20 to 30 years to come up with a new corn line. And what he said in that paper was by the time you come up with a new corn line that's adapted to a temperature that, you know, is 10 years from now, you're going to have to redo the whole thing again because it's just changing quickly enough that traditional breeding techniques are not going to be able to keep pace with it.
Great, thank you. Anyone have any other? Yep, go ahead, Andy.
So interesting talk. My question about the oat populations, would you characterize the improved performance of the oats due to tillering like the rice, or is there something else there? Have you looked at it from a genetic standpoint and looked for QTLs that characterize that change?
We have not done that. That's an excellent point. We don't know the basis for why that wild oat is doing better under current CO2 levels. Now part of the problem we have is that we didn't keep tabs on that field for 50 years. So we don't know if there was some other event that may have triggered this. We're assuming it's CO2, and you know, it may not be a valid assumption. We did not see any differences in germination. We did not see any differences in emergence. We did see a difference in overall leaf area per tiller production and more tillers, but we haven't quantified that as yet. So, thank you.
Anyone else have a question for Lew? Anyone online, folks?
Question.
Oh, sorry, Matt. Yeah, go ahead.
First a comment. I find it ironic that all that we've learned about artificial selection has resulted in us being less efficient than nature is.
Right.
Isn't that amazing? The question, are there parallels with nitrogen? We now add fertilizer in a lot of the agricultural systems in the world. Seems like we must have selected deliberately for crop plants that make better use of nitrogen. Are there parallels from that?
That is an excellent observation. I would imagine there would be, but I'm not aware of any at the top of my head. I'd have to go and look and see if there are specific works that have done that. But in the context of any major change in a resource, whether it's nitrogen or water, what we tend to do is select for those that are best adapted to that change. And so that is a very strong selection pressure. So I can't imagine that hasn't occurred, but I don't have a good enough knowledge of that to respond whether that is in fact what's been observed.
This is Jeff, just a comment. I mean, one thing with that is that, you know, we're deliberately manipulating nitrogen availability in so many cases and trying to tailor to that, as opposed to in CO2 where we're not really paying attention to it. It's changing constantly everywhere, and so it's more likely to be overlooked, I think.
Yeah, but we're still increasing nitrogen every place, and physiologically for a plant, increasing nitrogen, increasing CO2, increasing water, there are a lot of similarities in genetic control and physiology of growth responses.
Any final questions? Yes, Denacia.
Denacia Carley, NC State. I just have a comment, and that is that NC State's had a long-running breeding program with soybeans. This predates me by quite a bit, but I think they said they've been working on breeding for drought tolerance and glycine max for over 25 years. And in the last 5 years, the lab that I was working with finally was able to bring in genes from a weedy soybean species, glycine soja, and actually provide drought tolerance in soybean crops. Under severe drought stress, they were increasing yield substantially, 10 to 15%, and very consistently. The issue was under regular, quote, normal years, they were not increasing yield. And it turned out that 25 years worth of breeding They finally were able to sort of crack that code, increase yield in drought years, and nobody wanted to buy the seed because it's really all about yield. And unfortunately, just this year, that program was defunded. And so it comes sort of full circle back to the same issue that we're all talking, or we haven't really talked about yet, but we're all facing, is that unless you're hitting certain marks, and some of them are artificial, there's no funding for those programs to continue.
That's a really good observation, and it's not unique to soybean. It's been seen for some of the drought tolerant lines for corn, for example, where they do well if there is a drought, but don't do as well if it's a normal year. The question, but the larger observation is what is normal these days moving forward. If you look at, say, wheat production in Kansas, what you tend to find is that you see the sort of rise due to the Green Revolution and the increase in overall inputs, nitrogen and so forth. But if you go back for the last 10 to 15 years, what you see is production doing this, right? More ups and downs on the average honeymoon. And one of the problems with that is when you look at this emphasis on monocultures, is that a single monoculture is not designed to be able to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. So diversity is one of the things that I think anyway is a focus, or should be a focus, on management going forward, so that instead of planting only russet Burbank potatoes, you plant maybe 10 or 12 different lines of potatoes, where if you have a bad year, one of those will survive. One of those will do well. And I think that perhaps we haven't hit that economic threshold yet, but I think at some point we probably will. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Lew. We're going to move on to our final speaker of this morning's session, and that's going to be Jeff Dukes from Purdue University, and going to talk to us a little bit about invasive species. And so, Jeff, when you're queued up.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm going to focus on invasive plant species today, and I know not everybody works on invasive plant species, but I think that that I'll try to stay general with a lot of what I'm talking about. And so if you tend to picture insects, weeds in a crop setting, whatever, that's great. I'm going to ask you to sort of pick an organism and think about it a little bit during the talk. And maybe make some comments on that. So when I think of invasive plant species, I'm thinking about plant species that do some sort of ecological harm in a natural or semi-natural context, mainly. But certainly that definition can also encompass species that come in from other continents and do economic harm here. Anyway, we could debate exactly what the definition of invasive species is or should be for hours, and I'll try to avoid that. But I am going to be asking you to try to think of species that you care about in your context, and maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation along the way about those. So clearly when we think about invasive species and the problems associated with biological invasions, the root cause is that we're increasing dispersal of propagules, or basically biological units around the planet. We're mixing things up, we're transporting things everywhere, and we understand that. And then those different species that we're moving around have a variety of impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And there are dramatic examples of invasive species changing the nutrient cycling in ecosystems, the hydrology, even the geomorphology, the orientation of sand dunes on the coast. And the other thing that we're here to talk about more today, though, is that we're changing the environment in so many ways other than just mixing up species. And so we're changing the climate, we're increasing atmospheric CO2, as Lew was talking about. We're moving nitrogen around, we're fertilizing all over the place, as Matt was sort of implying just a minute ago. And that nitrogen that we fertilize in one place is moving around and fertilizing lots of places we didn't intend to. We're shifting up the landscape, we're disturbing and fragmenting habitat. And all of these different aspects of global change can then affect invasive species, and they can do that in different ways. And so today I'm going to talk about some of those different ways they can do that. I won't talk so much about how ecosystem impacts can feed back to global changes, but I think they do as well. But mainly today I'll focus on climate change in particular and how that might affect the prevalence of a variety of different invasive species. So, as I alluded to before, what I'd like you to think about a little bit right now is when it comes to invasive species and environmental changes, and specifically climate change, what is the worst case scenario that concerns you the most? What is the species that you, and it, you know, whether you're a climate modeler or a pest manager or an academic working on plant pathogens, you probably have one or two species that are dear to your heart, and so I wonder, you know, what are those? And I want you to keep those in mind as I talk, because each of us will have sort of different parts in the overall invasion process that are likely to be most important and most affected by climate change. And it might be interesting to hear a little bit about those as we go. So if we think about a generalized invasion, there are different stages that we can attribute to it. So an invasive species will start out as a native species somewhere in its native range, up in the black box here. And for some proportion of native species, they never leave. And so that's great. They're not going to be invasive species. But some proportion of them cross the geography barrier somehow. We transport them to a new location. And so that gives them the potential to be invasive species. Well, right there we have one barrier being crossed. That's one barrier that can be affected by these global environmental changes like climate change, right? So what's an example of that? Your example may or may not, you know, the species that you have in mind may or may not be affected by this. Certainly by just the phenomenon of transport in general is affecting lots of things. But is climate change affecting transport in some way? Well, certainly it is. For instance, if it opens up sea passages over the Arctic that reduce the transport time for ships, then invasive species that are carried in marine ballast, in ballast water of ships, could get from one port to another port in less time than they used to. Well, for some ballast organisms, that might be important in terms of increasing their survival rates across that passage. And so if there aren't regulations in place to make sure that ships exchange ballast water at sea before pulling into a port, they may be pulling in invasive species from one bay and depositing them in another, and some of those species may survive. We already do this in massive amounts, but climate change could change the profile of the surviving species that show up in a new location. Okay, so let's say your species has made it to this new place. Then suddenly it has to survive in the new environmental conditions it finds there. So the barrier here is abiotic conditions. What's the seasonal course of temperature? What's the seasonal course of soil moisture in that site? VPD, whatever it happens to be for your organism at certain times. What are those critical times? Well, climate change obviously can affect abiotic conditions, right, by definition. And so that's something that may affect your organism, whether it's through precipitation or temperature or VPD or whatever, minimum winter temperature or whatever. Okay, so let's say this organism arrives in the new location and it survives. It can live there. Well, at that point, what if it has neighbors? What if it has herbivores, predators, mutualists that it needs? There are a variety of biotic interactions that could be important. How are those going to be affected by climate change? Is climate change going to strengthen the competition with the C4 species, the C4 weed that just arrived because maybe the CO2 concentration is increased and the C3 plants are growing better, the C3 competitors are growing better? There are a variety of different ways that you can imagine those biotic interactions might change. Okay, but let's say it survives and the population grows. Then, if it's really going to be invasive, it needs to find a way to spread out across the landscape. Well, climate change might affect the landscape factors as well, too. Maybe it depends on there being hosts that are spread out across the landscape in certain ways. Maybe climate change is going to, in some way, affect fragmentation of habitat in a region by increasing demand for agriculture, creating new corridors of disturbance that will allow that species to propagate across the landscape. These are just different factors that are, or different sort of stages during the process of invasion. And the point of going through this is to illustrate that there could be a whole variety of different ways that different species might be affected by climate change in the end. And trying to stand up here and give you a prediction for all of them is not going to be possible in half an hour, right? It's going to be complex. And I'll give you a few examples of species, but I'm not going to go through everything. So climate change could affect each of these barriers. Would any of you be willing to share with me, with us, the sort of thought process that you've just been through with whatever species you're picturing? I'd love to have an example or two to just sort of keep in mind as we go. If anyone, yeah, Steve.
Japanese knotweed.
Okay, so what did you think about that going through?
So it has been, fairly successful, and it's obviously the geography, it's been brought to this country in various locations. And I guess the abiotic conditions, it seems to thrive pretty well. Biotic interactions, I guess it's been very successful across all of those barriers where you've kind of indicated. And I think many people probably know where, have examples of it. So it's down to the landscape spread level. I guess I would be interested if others have something that hasn't made it through, and do we know what those are?
Yeah, so I'll just point out maybe with that, and with many of these really widespread, super successful invaders, now maybe the question is, how are abiotic conditions going to shift the range where it's suitable? Is it going to be able to, and maybe biotic interactions that control that range as well as the abiotic interactions, but it's already crossed so many of those barriers, so it's more a question of what's the spread on the landscape. But yeah, go ahead.
I think a good example of that would be soybean rust that was introduced, about a decade ago, and it's never really established very well because it's an obligate parasite and it requires living tissue to survive the winter. But as our winters become more mild, as alternate hosts like kudzu moves further north, then there's actually a potential for it to get past that colonization stage and start to become really established.
Yeah, great, interesting. Yeah.
Blackberry rust, fragmenting violaceum, in what, 2000?
Oh yeah, your mic.
Sorry. Blackberry rust, fragmentum violaceum. In 2007, it caused significant crop losses in the Pacific Northwest for blackberry, but it hasn't raised its head again. When we did the population genetics work, as well as looking at host diversity, we saw a change in the host diversity, and the PopGen work of the rust showed that it had probably been there 10 to 7 years, but it still hasn't come back again. It was just this weird fluke of 2 years in a row that were prime conditions that caused it to be a commercial problem.
Interesting. And so the question is that going to continue? Are we going to see that again?
Are we going to see that more often?
Yeah. Steve?
So I think a new way to think about invasion, it seems like it focuses traditionally on transporting organisms from one place to another, getting them across some sort of geographic barrier. But it seems like a new way maybe to think about this is that under climate change, you've got organisms that can stay put and the habitat changes around them. And so to the extent that an invasive species is a species that exists somewhere where it didn't evolve, or with a community of plants with which it didn't evolve, under this changing climate, and this is what we see with a lot of native species like pine beetles probably, they didn't have to move at all. The habitat where they lived changed to where there was now susceptible tree species or differences in the critters that they interact with. And so it's just different perspective, and that's what I was thinking about during this.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about native pests, and to some extent that sort of thing might also apply for things like ornamental plants in gardens, where we're not having any problems with them now, but weather changes around that or climate changes around that, and suddenly, and there's been a recent article by Mark Van Kloinen, I think it was, in his lab about this, that, you know, maybe which of these are going to become invasive, and how's that going to work? So both with natives and things that we think of as benign currently. Yeah.
Well, kind of the flip side of it is how agricultural crops are invasive species, because most of them are not in their native habitat, and it's shifting the ecosystem just by having that cropping system there.
Soybean rampages across the landscape. Yeah, no, but I get your point. Yeah, absolutely. And so we're totally changing conditions around this import. Yeah. Any others? Yeah.
I'm a plant pathologist by training, but I thought we should talk about an insect, right? So I was going to talk about red imported fire ant, and we used to think that the spread of the northern spread might be retarded by hard frosts and hard freezes, but as we've warmed and we see fewer and fewer hard freezes, they continue to march northward. And now in the south, we talk a lot less about the red imported fire ant, and now we're talking about the crazy ant, which I'll just put in a plug. If you don't know about the crazy ant, look at it on YouTube. It is awesome and scary, right? Of course, but you know, that it is crazy. But you know, I'm thinking about sort of, you know, one invasive is now actually being moved out of its environment because of another invasive species. And now I've exhausted my knowledge of entomology.
That's great, thank you. Well, so great, a variety of different examples to keep in mind as we go through this. And so as I focus more on plants, we can also try to keep a broader perspective in our collective heads here. So each of these invaders can be affected at different stages and also at different scales potentially by these different processes. And I haven't talked about the scale issue as much, but that's certainly something that these different processes are operating at different scales, and the biotic resistance may operate at a very different one than abiotic conditions and so on. On the other end, we can also think about the impacts of these species. And so one equation that Ingrid Parker and colleagues published in 1999 that's really useful in thinking about impacts for invasive species is that you can basically look at the overall consequences of an invasive species as being a product of the size of the range of that species, its abundance within that range, and then the effect that each individual is having on whatever process you have of interest. Okay, so if you're trying to understand how climate change may affect impacts of invasive species, then you can think that, well, it could affect any of these. It could affect the size of the range through these abiotic constraints. It could affect the abundance in the range through, for instance, biotic interactions that the species is having with competitors or herbivores, whatever. And potentially it could affect its per capita impact as well, although there's been less work done on that, and it's a little harder to think about. One other thing, though, that I think is really important when thinking about the climate change invasions issue is that there may be an impact of an invasive species on something that we care about, but that may not be the only effect on that thing that we care about, and climate change might also affect it. So, for instance, whatever that process is, or that species, maybe native population is that we care about, it may be affected itself by climate change, which would say it makes whatever process or thing you're thinking about more rare or less abundant. That might mean that any impact of the invader is all the more important, right? Because there's less of that precious thing that you care about to begin with. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that, or what that process or thing is that might be that's being affected by your invasive species. It might be less easy to picture for the crazy ant than a plant pathogen, for instance. But one example for this might be, well, there. So can you think of an example, right? So I'll provide one for you, and then if you want to share one, I'd be very happy to hear other examples, because this isn't always easy for me to think about. And this is also maybe a little bit controversial, because different people have different perspectives on exactly what the impacts of Tamarix species, these invasive shrub/tree species, are in the western riparian zones. But many people have put forward that it uses more water than native species, and whether, if you're one of the insiders on this issue, how much you go along with that is, we can debate that later. But it could have big impacts on water, and if climate change is already, as we've seen today from Ben, going to massively decrease water availability in the Southwest, that makes water all the more valuable in the Southwest. And so every liter that's transpired by Tamarix that wouldn't have been by a native ecosystem becomes more valuable, whether it's for hydropower generation or for watering, irrigation of crops, or for drinking water use, right? So, so suddenly, if you're trying to think about how important your invasive species is in context of that resource now, it's actually potentially going to be much more important in the future, and you should potentially think about it differently than you would otherwise. So does anybody else have an example from their organism that they think is kind of interesting in that way, where you're thinking of something that might be valuable that would decrease or increase in abundance under climate change? That's all right. It's a little harder to think about. But if something pops into your head, please share it with the group or with me later, because I'd love to hear examples. All right, so we can think generally about different environmental changes and whether they would potentially increase or decrease the prevalence of invasive plant species. This is a table from a paper that Bethany Bradley led, and Lew is an author, a co-author on this paper, if I remember right. And this is looking at basically how all these different factors might increase or decrease the prevalence of plant invaders. The take-home message is that most of these things are likely to increase the prevalence of invasive plant species, particularly increased atmospheric CO2 based on the balance of the literature that's out there right now. But things like rising temperature and changing precipitation regimes, there are cases when they could benefit or act to the detriment of invasive species, just depending on where the invasive species is relative to its climatic tolerances and those of its competitors and neighbors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the options that we have then to deal with invasive species and manage them and minimize these impacts are potentially quite different in different types of systems. So this is a figure, part of a figure from a book chapter by Dana Blumenthal and Julie Cray here that shows how these different impacts might be manifest in agricultural systems. And I'll contrast that with natural systems in a minute here. But basically, the dark bars here are things that are positive. The white bars are things that are negative, and the white arrows are things that are negative, and the gray arrows are somewhere in between. And the width of the arrow has to do with how strong an impact you'd expect with a given pathway. So in agricultural systems, the idea is that increasing CO2 could benefit fast-growing invasive species, and other changes in the climate might be, in some cases, beneficial, in some cases, negative. At the same time, the crop is probably going to see more or less similar consequences from these different global change factors. So CO2, on balance, in the absence of everything else, might benefit fast-growing crop species. Changes in temperature, precipitation, less, it sort of depends on where the crop is within the range. And extreme events are likely to impact crops negatively. And we just heard a lot more from Lew on this with greater context and the consequences for interactions between crops and weeds. But there are a lot of tools at the ready for farmers to deal with this. They can choose different crops. They can potentially, if we get our act together, we can use artificial selection to try to help these crops grow better under future conditions. There are also things that are benefiting invasive species or the weed community, whether it's rapid evolution, shifts in communities, because there's a whole bunch of different weed species out there, not just one, like the crop, presumably. The weeds are likely to have broad tolerance of these conditions and to disperse easily. All right, so I'm going to just contrast that then with the natural system. In the natural system, the basic difference here is that the native species are likely to be much more negatively impacted by these changes in conditions. under many circumstances. So particularly in situations where you have relatively slow-growing native species that are adapted to maybe poorer soil conditions, or maybe less moisture in conditions where the moisture availability is increasing. So under natural systems, you're likely to see basically native species being more disadvantaged relative to fast-growing invasive species. And the tools to help them are, you would argue, maybe I would argue, less powerful. So one is shifts in the community. So maybe you'll have some native species that come in and do better under the future climate. But it's going to be dependent on who's there. And another potential way of saving these native species is through assisted migration that we talked about earlier. And that's a little controversial potentially in terms of what if you're introducing something to a new environment that itself becomes invasive. Although personally, I feel like this risk is in most cases going to be quite small. If we're trying to move something to a new community to save it, I think it's generally unlikely to be problematic in that new community. But the idea of associated pests and pathogens being problematic is a very interesting one that I think should be thought about more. Okay, so I want to unpack that a little bit and talk about some basically working hypotheses and a few little results about why invasive species might be more responsive than natives in some communities. There are a variety of different reasons having to do largely with the greater sort of plasticity of invasive species than natives. But I'll start first with some results just looking at comparisons of native and non-native species, so not necessarily invasive, but non-native as opposed to invasive species with native species. So these are not necessarily invasive species, but this is just looking at the effects in situations where there were natives and non-natives together in ecosystems, the effects of temperature, CO2, increases in precipitation, and decreases in precipitation in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, or everything lumped together. This is from a paper by Cascade Sorty and colleagues that came out a few years ago. In many situations, the responses are not terribly dissimilar of native and non-native species, but like in aquatic ecosystems, responses of aquatic species to temperature, they look a little bit different here, but they're really not. There's no statistical difference here. But there are some things that do sort of jump out. So if you look at responses of terrestrial species to elevated CO2, you do see a positive response of non-native species to elevated CO2, but you don't see a significantly positive response of native species. So there are little glimpses of differences here, but I think that to some extent this is looking at non-natives and not just invasives, and that this doesn't give you the full picture. So I want to go through some reasons that you might expect that that native systems and species would maybe have a harder time adapting to a changing climate, not just a different climate, but a rapidly changing climate than invasive species in particular. So often in native systems, you'll have species that have long juvenile period, long lifespan, relatively little dispersal, and not all the species will be like this, but many of them. And all of these are going to present hurdles in a rapidly changing climate, particularly for the species that are towards the edge of their climatic limits. So if this means then that you have less diversity in some regions, and this erodes biotic resistance, then these systems could be more easily invaded in the future. Now, I think this is still a big question mark, but it certainly seems reasonable to me. On the other hand, invasive species are typically well adapted to a changing climate because they have traits, many of them, that allow rapid range shifts. And for plants, this may be a short juvenile period. They may be good at long-distance dispersal. Really, they've been proven to be good at long-distance dispersal, whether it's because we are moving them or whether they've moved somewhere on their own. That's part of them being invasive in the first place. There are interesting other things that seem to come out. So Invasive plants, in one context at least, seem to track climate change better. They have more plasticity in terms of their flowering times and being able to shift their flowering times to match climate relative to native species. So this is a paper by Charles Willis and colleagues that came out in 2001 that just shows basically a greater shift of flowering times from 1900 to the present in species in New England in the invasive species than the native species. So the native species haven't shifted their flowering time in response to the warming that's happened over that time period, whereas the invasive species have. Invasives are often, and not always, but have often been seen to be more climate tolerant than non-invasive species. So in some families, invasive species span greater latitudes in their native ranges. That's one line of evidence. Another line of evidence is that as the breadth of the climate tolerance of a species goes up in Europe, a plant species goes up, the probability of its being invasive increases as well. So basically, the more climatic regions that it occupies here on the x-axis, the greater the probability of its being invasive is on the y-axis here. So that would suggest then that invasive species are just going to be less affected by climate change than many native species or the non-invasive species in particular. You could also argue, and there's not really much evidence for this, but you could argue that invasive species aren't going to be terribly dependent on mutualists in many cases, or are going to be less dependent on mutualists because they've succeeded in some new continent, some new context. And so if climate change disrupts mutualisms by shifting the time periods when the mutualist and say the plant species are active, invasive species are relatively unlikely to be affected by that. Okay, so these are some generalities. You might want some specific predictions. To do this, we would typically look at something like species distribution models or some sort of model. You know, we could think that they should project that some invasive species will benefit, have more suitable area, other invasive species might have contracting ranges. So we use niche-based models, species distribution models, habitat suitability models, whatever you want to call them, whatever flavor you want to use to project this. Here's one example that I like from Bethany Bradley and colleagues. She's looked at a bunch of different species in different parts of the world, but this is just a map for yellow star thistle. And here in the black, we see its actual recorded occurrence. In the red, we see the potentially suitable climate that is based on where the climate's where it occurs now. You can take those, so now we have a map of, area that we think could be climatically suitable for yellow star thistle right now. You can then look at what future climates might look like and do this for a whole bunch of different models, and that's what she's done here. The redder the color is, the more models project that an area will be suitable for yellow star thistle towards the end of this century. And the hatched areas here are areas where it would potentially expand, so areas that are not currently climatically suitable. So blue is pretty unlikely. It's just one out of the 6 or more models that she used in this analysis. I'm forgetting off the top of my head exactly how many models she used, but blue areas are pretty unlikely, but as you get redder and redder, these areas might be climatically suitable. You can also look at how the range might contract. So here's this figure on the right just shows the climatically suitable range now and how many models project that would still be suitable in the future. For yellow star thistle, there's a lot more expansion than contraction. If I showed you the figures that she has for cheatgrass, you'd see a lot of contraction as well as some expansion. Okay, so you can use these models. They're a good tool for projecting what the future might look like for these species, but they have issues. They often ignore soil type. They're typically pretty coarse in spatial scale. They don't have topography. They don't have microclimates often. Some of them do. They all, I believe, ignore the effects of CO2 and what consequences that might have for water tolerance or drought tolerance, basically, of plants. And they don't have competition explicitly in the models. So there are lots of issues. Biocontrol ranges aren't in the models too, so lots of complications in real life that aren't there. But they have many advantages, so it'd be great to make them better if we want to have better projections for what the future of these plant communities might look like. You know, we might be able to bring together modelists and experimentalists to improve them, to do some work on the ground, to see whether how accurate they are, and some of that work has begun. We could also be collecting more detailed and widespread and standardized data on invasive species ranges, and we are starting to do that more in different parts of the country. And with new technologies, different apps, like EdMaps has an app that you can use to record where invasive plants are, and that goes into a large database. So some of these, I think, issues can be overcome over time. I'm going to take, I don't know how quickly you want me to wrap up, Steve, but I'm going to maybe just take a couple minutes and go through briefly a paper that some colleagues and I just came out with recently that looks at a related but slightly different question, which is globally, how well prepared are we for new invasion threats, and where are those invasion threats likely to be? This, in some ways, I feel like this builds on the things that Jim was talking about this morning, and also highlights the great inadequacy of the protections that we already have in place. So Regan Early led this project that looks at the potential changes in threats from invasive species over the rest of this century, and how prepared nations are to deal with these threats. But it was a large team effort. So what we did was we looked at basically a variety of metrics that we think could be indicators for invasion threats in the future globally. And so this goes from, well, a lot of this is based on imports, so seaport capacity. If we just look down the left-hand side, seaport capacity, airport capacity, and total imports, that is distributed by basically population across the landscape. And then in the bottom, we look at animal and plant imports and the intensity of animal and plant imports across the landscape. And then we also, and so all three of those metrics on the left go into what we call introduction threat, basically. How great is the pressure likely to be of species being introduced to different areas in the world? And then on the right, we have what we call the ingredients of establishment threat. So how much is biotic resistance in different areas likely to be eroded by ongoing changes? So biome shift is at the top. Really, that's a climate change driven measure. Where in the world are we expecting to see lots of species turnover by the end of this century? And we're assuming that where there's a lot of species turnover, there might be more opportunity for invasive species to take hold. Where in the world is there likely to be agricultural increased agricultural activity by the end of the century? We think that disruption could provide opportunities for invasion. And then where are fire regimes going to be changing? We think that could present opportunities for different species to succeed as well. So we sort of combined those metrics of how much are things in the environment changing to come up with a measure of establishment threat. And then we put those, and so the introduction threat and establishment threat are shown on the bottom here. And then we put those together into an overall metric that we say is invasion threat, some indicator, and we're not saying this is perfect or really necessarily, this is just an attempt to get at where the invasion pressures may be greatest by the end of this century. And so you can see a lot of these pressures are places where we already have a lot of people, but some of them are in regions that are developing. The other thing that we did then is we said, well, how prepared are countries? And we went through all of the countries' reports that we could get our hands on to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And since the US is not actually a party to that convention, we had to use different reports to come up with a metric for our country. But we came up with measures of what we consider the country's proactive capacities and reactive capacities for dealing with invasions. So proactive capacity, how prepared are they to deal with invasions well, to keep invasions out in the first place, to detect invasive species and knock them down before they get established, and reactive capacity, how well aware are they of what's there and how much capacity do they have to get rid of it once it's arrived. And blue is good and red is bad on these maps, and not surprisingly, the developing countries tend to fare poorer in this metric. And then we basically combined the two maps and said, well, where are the invasion threats greatest in the future where the countries aren't prepared? And so these maps basically give you an idea of regions of the world that might be expecting to see a lot of species coming in, but not have a lot of capacity to deal with them. And so, one question that I had jumbling around in my head after Jim's talk was, well, how much of our funding or our effort should we invest in dealing with the problems that we have in this country? We know we can knock them down to some extent, but how much of our collective effort should go towards doing that, and what are the sort of marginal gains on that? Certainly, we need to do that and improve that, but relative to many other countries, we're actually doing great. That's a depressing thought, I know, but some of these other countries are also going to be very important for food security and have very little capacity to deal with all the invasions that are coming in. So that's all I've got, except I'll give a plug for a lot more information on this in Lew's 2 books that I happen to be lucky enough to co-author or edit with him. There's obviously a ton more on this topic, and this book on the right in particular has, I wrote very, very little of that, so I can say it has a ton of great chapters on it in different regions of the world, how this problem impacts different regions and different processes and taxa. So that's it. That's all I've got. Thanks for participating with me in that.
Thanks, Jeff. So we've got a question, but I wanted to, I thought of an example from when no one gave you an example. So we looked at musk thistle in the Midwest and looked at how does it respond to grazing, and where you have established perennial grasslands, and how does it grow and develop. And we were fortunate enough to hit a drought year in 2012. And what was very interesting about this plant, it's been classified as a annual, a biennial, and a short-lived perennial, which just shows you the plasticity of this plant. But what was very interesting was under full canopy cover, the plant would emerge, grow, and then under the drought conditions, it actually senesced before producing a flower. It died. Basically, we saw all these plants dying under canopy cover. And this was under a drought condition. So our recommendation was, getting back to the practical side of it, was you should not overgraze, or you should even refrain from grazing pastures where musk thistle is threatening or has been known to occur, because where we saw the canopy removed, the musk thistle was actually surviving and reproducing. So in this drought type of scenario, it was important to let people know that refraining from grazing was actually even more of a thing to be doing, other than just sustaining the native or the grassland, but also preventing this invasion from happening, and actually a way to inhibit it. So that's something that we saw that I think relates to kind of that economic, practical aspect of it. But I just wanted to share that because I think there's some relevance there to what you were talking with Tamarix.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? We had a question. We've got one question online. I want to get to this online question first. So Nancy, can you read that out?
It refers to one of your graphs. Ag system graph shows artificial selection for crops as greater impact than rapid evolution for invasive species. But earlier discussion indicated that crop breeding, especially within economic constraints, is slower than natural genetic responses of weeds. Reasonable to expect artificial selection of crops to keep up with climate change seems doubtful.
Yeah, I think that's a totally reasonable point based on the previous discussion that we had. And I guess, I guess one thing you could say is that it's under our control right? More than the native species genetic diversity is. So we could decide to do a better job of that. The economic constraints on that and the sort of logistical constraints, the current model that we have might not be conducive to that, but it's not something we couldn't do. Now, it's not my figure, so I can't give you exactly the thinking behind it, but that would be, I guess, one way of responding is that at least that should be possible, and that's under our control, whereas in native systems, the amount of genetic diversity that's there on the ground might be more difficult to control.
Okay,
There were a couple other questions
Yep,
in the room. Yeah.
go ahead, and make sure you say your name before you talk.
Yeah, this is Nathan Mueller. I have a technical question and then a bigger picture question.
Yeah.
So the technical question was for the exercise that you presented at the end.
Yeah.
You had increased agricultural pressure or something as part of that, and I was just wondering how you're defining that variable and mapping it out. And then the big picture question was, as far as trying to increase capacity in these developing countries, how do you envision that going forward? Are there existing programs within USAID, for example, that should be strengthened, or so on and so forth?
That's a great question. So, yeah, so for the first one, it was increased land going into agriculture through, I'm forgetting right now exactly which data set we used, but projected by the end of the century for the region. And for the what do you do to help developing countries sort of side of thing, I think there are a variety of things that could happen, and I think that other people in the room will have a lot of good ideas on this front, and I won't have all of them, but you know, increasing. So we have international agencies that are trying to work, NGOs, and a variety of different types of organizations that are trying to work on this problem through communication, largely, of what invasive species are threats, and you know, how to manage invasive species, how to keep them out. It's going to require a bunch of different things, though. There has to be some investment in trying to keep them out, as well as investment in communicating to people who are managing the landscape, you know, farmers, people who are managing herds, whoever, as well as, you know, the various government agencies responsible on what species should they be concerned about, what are the emerging invasive species that or emerging pest species that they need to be dealing with, and how should they do that. And so I think there are these communication networks that need to happen, and then also within a region, the more communication across borders you can have of neighboring countries of, you know, these are the threats that we have, the better. Now, some of these organizations can facilitate that. You know, CABI is one organization that's I think working on the ground in Africa, for instance, and trying to deal with some of these issues and help them deal with these issues. There's a global invasive species compendium, right? That is a State Department product. Is that right, Lew? You can help me with, or.
It's partly the State Department, but it's partly a lot of independent NGOs that are working with the State Department.
Yeah.
We have over 50 countries that have signed up for it.
So for those of you online, it's a partly State Department, partly NGO-driven project of more than 50 countries that is supposed to be a resource for you know, understanding more information, as much information as possible for a given invasive species and being able to combat it. But I don't think anybody would tell you that there's the perfect mechanism out there. If anybody else wants to mention other mechanisms that we should keep in mind, then I'm happy. Yeah, Lew.
Well, I'm hoping that someday there would be some kind of, you know, I don't know, handheld computer device that maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, you know, some kind of, you know, you could put observations in of different invasive species around the world, and some kind of, we'll call it a global positioning system, GPS. That sounds kind of cool, doesn't it? And we could, you know, have that information available for this device that maybe 2/3 of the world would actually have access to, and we could then keep track of, you know, how these different invasive species or new pest threats might be cropping up around the world. If there was some organization, and again, I'm just spitballing here, you know, like an NSF kind of thing, where they would actually put the money up front so that every country in the world would have access to it. And we could keep track of, you know, these different, you know, invasive species and the threats that they would pose. But, you know, that's science fiction stuff. That's crazy. You know, that's never going to happen. But, you know, maybe someday, who knows, you know, you gotta dream big. You know, for maybe, you know, a few, 10, 20,000, maybe $100,000 investment, they could do something like that. But, you know, it's not for me to say what, you know, NSF or NIH or any of these major funding organizations could do, because, you know, that they, you know, if they have their own agendas, you know, what's to say? Sorry.
So Lew, this software, EdMaps is out there, right? That's doing that on handheld devices.
Yeah, EdMaps is doing it for the U.S. Japan has one doing it for Japan. But nobody's doing it globally. There's no one organization that stepped up to the plate that's taking the lead on it. And the problem is that, you know, invasive species, sadly enough, don't respect borders. And so it's hard sometimes to get a sense of how things are changing. We know that mountain pinebark beetle, for example, jumped over the Rocky Mountains. Barbara, is Barbara here? So, you know, we know it jumped from the west side to the east side, and there's nothing stopping it from moving across the mountains of Canada, coming into the eastern part of the U.S., except nobody's tracking it. So, you know, Canada might be tracking it, but the U.S. isn't tracking it because it's in Canada. So we can talk about this more, but there are a lot of opportunities here to begin to look at the overall issue of detection and tracking and keeping a sense of how quickly things are changing. So anyway, forgive my sarcasm, but yeah.
So I guess maybe one other issue that's relevant to that is that I don't think we have a good, and please correct me if I'm wrong if you know of another, but I don't think we have a good database that incorporates sort of simultaneously all those maps of invasive species and whatever else, and climate currently, and projections for future climate, and relevant metrics that are likely to affect those species. I mean, I think that lots of people have assembled them for individual species on individual computers, but my sense is that we don't have one spot where we can process everything relatively easily at once. And if someone knows of that spot, then please let me know. Yeah, 2 people know of that spot.
Herb Bolton, just one observation. You've talked about these natural systems with yellow star thistle and tamarisk, and I don't know that we've given this enough emphasis, but when you're in those natural systems, there's also threatened, endangered, and at-risk species, and we haven't even mentioned that. So when you try to do some sort of intervention in those natural systems, there's other agencies who have concerns about those other species of all taxa that prevent you from doing things that you would like to do to prevent them. And that's another set of data that you need in that data set, because you cannot do certain interventions where those threatened, endangered, and at-risk species exist. And those 2 examples you gave, tamarisk and yellow star thistle, are 2 great ones.
There might be a bird that people want to preserve that happens to live in some of your tamarisk stands that you're trying to get rid of, for instance. Yep. Yeah.
To go back to what's going on to help some of the developing countries, there are actually a lot of programs in existence. So the Foreign Ag Service just a couple of years ago invested $25 million in helping to increase the capability and the capacity for diagnostics in some of these countries. There are a lot of programs in there trying to help them establish the infrastructure that they need. The USDA has other programs specifically with trading partners. So some of these developing countries are becoming important trading partners. our plant protection and quarantine folks are actually over there helping them to create IPM programs for the commodities they're going to export, and their inspection and certification programs to minimize the probability of exporting pest. To go to that larger question, Lou, nothing that I know of at that level. Having said that, Jeff mentioned CABI. CABI has a program called PlantWise. It was originally called the Global Plant Clinic. And what they do is they literally go into rural communities in developing countries and set up a card table. They put up a poster that says, "Bring us your plant problems." And from that, they build. And the first time they go, maybe 15, 20 people show up. Within about 6 months, they're having 100 and 150 people show up. And they're connecting those people to all their experts back in the UK through cell phones. So now they're sending images of the issues that they're encountering, whether it be an arthropod or a plant with symptoms of some kind. And they're trying to make those connections to create the databases. What are we seeing in these countries, and can we provide information back? So some of that's happening. I don't know of a centralized effort that encompasses all of that. In the EU right now, they're trying desperately to establish a plant diagnostic network that maybe somewhat mimics ours here in the States, but it's different in the EU because they're not just state borders, they're national borders. And so you have the variance in institutional cultures, in languages, and in regulation. So there are challenges to making it work on a global scale, but there are efforts underway.
Any other questions? Online,
Jim,
folks?
Jim's got another point.
Go ahead, Jim, yeah.
So this is actually a question about, when you look, I'm having trouble formulating this question, but when you're looking at your predictive maps of where an organism might establish and spread.
Oh, yeah.
And then you incorporate a climate change projection that might indicate a range expansion. Going to some of Lew's work where you're looking at the organisms being able to adapt to climate change, would you then conclude that those predictive maps are conservative estimates of the range?
So yes and no. So you saw with the map of star thistle, for instance, that the projected suitable habitat was larger than where you actually find it, right? Because that's based on the climatic range in the areas where you find it. Now, you could argue that it just hasn't expanded into those areas yet, or you could argue that actually there are competitors that are keeping it out of the rest of that range, right? And so then making those projections going forward, you have the same issue. So maybe you would have more ability to expand over time that would develop, but on the other hand, maybe you'd have these competitive pressures that would keep it back. So I guess there are different forces going in each direction, and I don't think anyone can give you the right answer for that, you know. And it's one of those things that we just can't get everything into the models to make them perfect, but I think we can do a better job of linking together experiments on the ground with the models, with some of these models, to better understand what the true constraints are that lead to the ranges being what they are instead of what we might predict them to be. And that might allow us to further refine the models. And also if we could see if there have been maybe shifts within the population over time that would allow those ranges to shift because of changing biological constraints or sort of abiotic constraints based on the plant's own genetics.
Yeah, I know there's been some efforts. I've worked with some of those folks. But yeah, Liz, you had a question?
So Liz Blood, I'll take Lew's bait since I'm from NSF about the phone app. In fact, what sometimes referred to as citizen science is very much a focus of a number of programs across the National Science Foundation. And we're making investments to develop those kind of capabilities on a number of parameters. The challenge there is if you seek funding from NSF to do that, it has to be couched in a research question, a basic research. We just don't, fund people to build apps. But there are multiple programs across NSF in which you could do that. Another factor has to do with the issue of a global structure in order to tackle a question like this. To your point, Jim, there is, across federal agencies and across nation states, there's this effort called the Group on Earth Observations, and the U.S. has the U.S. Group on Earth Observations. Within that framework, there's a group called the Biodiversity, the Biological Observatory Network that's a framework within GEO that could be a global structure in which to try to get member states at least to agree to participate in such an effort. And there are funding mechanisms with NSF to actually get efforts like that going. We call them research coordination networks. And so it's $500,000 for 5 years, basically for groups to get together to talk about issues and grapple with problems such as, dealing with issues like invasive species largely around the globe, in which you're trying to develop a capability and tools and approaches to do it. So it's at least a 5-year consistent funding framework to begin to tackle the problem and perhaps design some ways to develop capabilities to address it. And there are also other just research funding opportunities, both in the Biodirectorate and the Geo Directorate, related to couple human natural systems, macrosystems, biology, ecosystems, and other geosciences programs that would, again, it's more focused on the basic fundamental science, but there are capabilities in which you can take these very applied problems and develop a capability more broadly in a more larger collaborative sense than you were mentioning, Lew.
Thank you for taking the bait. I'm hoping that others will too. I'd like to get a sense from all the experts in the room and how we can move forward on that. One minor problem, all those things that you mentioned are things I'm aware of to some extent, and I think they're really great efforts. Part of the issue, though, is related to sort of institutional barriers that are already in existence. For example, as an ARS scientist, I can't apply to NSF for funding. So why that?
Not true.
Not true? Tell me how I do that
you
then,
can,
because
but
I've been told specifically I can't apply.
Well, we can't pay federal salaries, and we can't buy instrumentation. But within the programs that I oversee, there are a number of federal scientists actually engaged in NSF-funded research. It's done through subawards. It's done through the federal scientist having leave and a faculty appointment. But there are a number of projects that we funded under macrosystems biology in which there are USGS, Smithsonian, EPA, and Forest Service scientists actively involved in it. So again, it's a matter of we can't pay your salary and we can't buy a federal agency a piece of equipment. But those are really the only restrictions.
Great. So you guys get together afterwards. And it's too bad Nancy Cavallero isn't here. She's not able to be here right now, but I think we can have this discussion even continue when she does arrive. It's close to noon, but we have 1 or 2 questions online, so let's do those and then we'll wrap up.
So one goes back to this previous to your discussion, and it's in regards to Jeff's last response. Is human transport to those potential suitable habitats included in those models? So that's going back to the discussion
So in the last paper that I discussed that looked at invasion threat, the human transport is a big driving factor in what we called introduction threat. So yes, it's very much included, particularly human transport of plants and animals, but transport of commerce in general. And also air travel is included in those models.
And the second is going back to yesterday. I just came across this on Twitter, and it goes back to Ken's talk. And there's just an article that says that Miami Zika search turns up another virus, and 2 people have now come down with dengue from Florida. So that just kind of wraps up what we're talking about, how it is a global issue.
Ken, do you want to say anything, or you good? Okay, so thank you for those comments online, and thank you, Jeff, for your presentation information. We're going to take a break and meet back here at 1 o'clock. So those of you online, please join with us again in about an hour. Thank you.